I read Laozi's Tao Te Ching, a new interpretation for a transformative time, as translated by Ken Liu. This is a work of scripture that's rendered from ancient Chinese, if you could call ancient Chinese, into modern English. And it has all kinds of additional material sprinkled throughout, not the least of which are reflective little essays by Liu, who is usually a fantasy and science fiction author, one of the best short story writers, I think, ever, and wrote some really interesting fantasy epics. But this is not fiction. Like I said, it's scripture. So I am Taoist, or I think of myself as a Taoist. If a Westerner can say that in the absence of a teacher and a temple. I've contemplated the Tao for decades and read many different translations, although I cannot read even modern Chinese, let alone ancient. I like this translation, though, because it gets rid of all kinds of fancy language that could be confusing and stifling, I think, in certain ways. So, for example, instead of saying sage or like master, he says a person who is Tao aware or Tao awakened, which I like. And sage is a person who is at a different kind of level in my mind than someone who has an awareness of how the Tao operates. I think I have some awareness of that, but I would not say that I am sagacious in any way, and certainly not the kind of Taoist sages, that come out of legend or who are alive on the earth right now. And so a lot of the times in the Tao Te Ching, when it talks about someone who demonstrates wisdom or operates in a particular way, we're not really talking about those sages anyway. We're just talking about somebody who successfully has a practice of Wu Wei, or the doing without doing. In addition to word choices like that, Liu also, like I said, he has little personal essays, and he kind of has a sneaky little introduction that happens after the first or second chapter of the book, and he has an afterword, but it happens before the end of the book. And so those kind of like playing with language there is really fun, especially given the Tao's relationship, or the Tao Te Ching's relationship with language. The very first thing that the Tao Te Ching talks about is the way in which language is inadequate to discuss the Tao. And so it's a very tricky thing for a translator and an author to walk into that space. But I think he does a really beautiful job. And then in addition to the entire Tao Te Ching, he also includes some parables and other interludes from Zhuangzi, who is probably the other great source of Taoist scripture outside of the slim little book of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is full of contradictory language. The first time that I read it, when I was very young, like in my 18, 19 years old kind of age, I thought a lot of it was stupid or didn't make any sense, really. It would just say something and then it would say the opposite of it. And it seemed not very helpful. And also to like start off by saying that you can't really write down anything useful about the Tao and that it's impossible to really talk about it seemed like a weird way to begin what I thought of as the Bible of Taoism. But I understand a lot better now what it's going for there, and talking about how we can get caught up in expressing ourselves or the meaning of things rather than holding to the soul of an issue or fully experiencing something, and instead kind of reducing it to an intellectual experience or some kind of anecdote that can be related from one person to another. The unique thing about the Tao Te Ching versus other kinds of scriptures is that it is not trying to give you a bunch of rules. Instead, it is reshaping the way that you think. And to come back to it again and again throughout my life, I see it very, very differently. And passages that once frustrated me now give me a deep sense of comfort, while still having elements to it that I find very challenging and respect even more for their kind of moral insight and humaneness. One part of the Tao Te Ching that I really love, from chapter 18, it says, when the Tao is forgotten, goodness and piety appear. When the country falls into chaos, patriotism is born. And it's that kind of thing that feels like two different, opposing kind of forces that have nothing to do with each other. But what it actually is that like all motion is counter motion. That when you move in one direction, it causes a different thing to arise. And that is the way in which the Tao Te Ching kind of rearranges your thinking. And Liu went to the Tao Te Ching for the first time in his life during the COVID lockdown, and he writes about it in the book. And that's exactly what chapter 18 of the Tao Te Ching is about, that in the midst of a crisis where your spirit is troubled, you turn to religion, in a time like you're not religious and suddenly you become religious, right? In other words, this is natural. And it shows the way in which when people are becoming religious, when people become pious, then that is a sign of trouble, actually. Like most religions would say, like, oh, that is a sign of goodness, that the bad things are coming into our lives in order to draw us closer to God or the right way of being. But the Tao Te Ching shows that it just means that things are unbalanced in some essential way. And so when people go around thumping their chest and being patriotic, it shows you that the country is like deeply troubled and disordered. And so any outward signs of strength point to inward weaknesses. And you could say the reverse is true as well, a kind of inverted version of that. What appears to be outwardly weak is probably inwardly strong. And so you take a person who looks like they're not ambitious and not competent, but actually that person is deeply secured and untroubled, unanxious in the way that they live their life, very clear-eyed and clear-headed about what they want and how they're going to get it. And so the Tao Te Ching is really good at reordering priorities and perspective, I think. And Liu takes advantage of all of the great parables of Zhuangzi, and you have stuff like the story of the butcher who never has to sharpen his knife or replace it because he perfectly is able to cut in between and with all of the parts of the animal, or the different stories of Kongzi and Laozi speaking to each other. Kongzi is Confucius, and the way that Confucius is baffled or awed by Laozi's wisdom. Those are always funny to me because like so much of, I think, Taoism is about taking the kind of Maoist, sorry. Mao is a completely different kind of guy. The Maoist kind of logical empiricism and applying it to the teleological roles of, family and government. That's kind of Confucius's whole thing. And so there's this logical chain of progression where you have this premise leads to that conclusion, and it all fits together very, very nicely. And over in Taoism, there's demonstrations of how if you just keep using logic in a kind of chain that never ends, it becomes absurdity very, very quickly. And so the fact that, everything seems to fit together so nicely in Kongzi's configuration of the universe seems to be because he stops using logic once he gets to the conclusion that he wants. And so you have like little logical sayings of, like, well, if you want to find something, then you should try losing it first, because logically you can't find things that haven't been lost. And that seems absurd, but it's actually completely correct. And so you can't achieve peace in a country without going to war. And that is not what Confucius says in his ideology, but it must be true because it is the difference and contrast that causes things to emanate in exactly the way that I was saying earlier. So I always like those little stories of those two guys getting together and Kongzi just being baffled by Laozi. And so it's a very brief little piece of scripture. I mean, the Tao Te Ching is, and this is a little bit longer because of all of the additional material, but it's very well crafted. It's very thoughtful. And I enjoy that it's made by somebody who is not necessarily a Taoist or a person who is an authority, or has special deep insight because of years and years of study. Like I said, he's somebody who read this for the very first time during the 2020 lockdown and then published his translation, a year or two after that. So there's something very authentic about the kind of effect that it had on him and his response to it, and turning around and kind of sharing that with the rest of us, that I really enjoy.